Okay, so we're back to cracks in postmodernity with a very special guest, Dr. Charles Camosy, who has written many books, including just some of the many. For the Love of Animals, Beyond the Abortion Wars, Resisting Throwaway Culture, Losing Our Dignity. You can look up all the others on his website, and is currently teaching at Creighton School of Medicine, but also was my professor at Fordham University. So this is why we're very excited to have him on. So thank you for coming.
Of course, Stephen, it's good to be with you and in this new way of exchanging. You just told me that you're moving on to the next level, teaching as an adjunct and at the college level, and I couldn't be more proud of you. So great to be with you.
Thank you. Yes. So yeah, you've written about all kinds of topics, but what I would like to talk about now is the breakdown of the two-party system in the US. You've written a lot about politics, about the divide that we're seeing, the increasing divide in our country, and all the ideological divisions. So yeah, can you start by talking about why you think the system of politics, the party politics in the country is breaking down? What are the sources of these divisions and all that?
Well, specifically thinking about the two-party system, I mean, at a very basic level, it's just the fact that the political, social, moral reality that people are facing, even within single issues, like say race or abortion, simply don't fit into a binary either or answer. In fact, if you were just talking to somebody who knew nothing about politics or ethics or anything like that, if you told them the problem and you told them the various permutations and options and complexities of the problem, and you said, and by the way, our culture tends to handle these things by saying you can either take this position or that position. They would obviously look at you like you had two heads. Well, why would you be offered only those two? So at a very basic level, it's just the fact that it doesn't work. People don't think of themselves as choosing between two different options, and the way it plays out, as far as I can tell, in many contexts, is they don't in fact think there are two options, but they pick a side that they hate more than the other side, and kind of define themselves by opposition to that side, and say, I don't know what I am. Maybe I'm not a Republican. Maybe I'm not a Democrat. I don't know what I am, but I know I hate that group really, really a lot, and I'm going to define myself in opposition to that group. We could say more about that, but I guess that's where I see things at a very basic level right now.
Yeah, so one of the things that you talk about in Resisting Throwaway Culture is that a lot of this division comes from a disconnect from the individual, from the basic realities of neighborhood, of tradition, even of our own bodies. And I think part of it is just like the breakdown of first local level community political affairs. Like most of what we're focusing on is on the national level, on this bigger scale that we're physically removed from. But also just basic things like social media, using the internet, disconnects us from the people in our immediate surroundings, and again, from really being in touch with our own bodies, ourselves. So can you say more about that disconnect of the individual from the immediate kind of everyday realities that they're in?
Yeah, there are obviously multiple reasons for that, and you suggested some of them. But maybe again, to just get down to basics or fundamentals, it does primarily reside, I think, in a kind of idolatry, right? An idolatry of national politics, especially since 2015. It was there before, but and maybe the super fuel of that kind of idolatry is the smartphone and social media, and especially Twitter and YouTube and other vehicles using algorithms to kind of capture our attention, and especially, again, our disgust or our opprobrium or our hate for the quote other side, or the side that we define ourselves in opposition to. And when that kind of idolatrous way of being in the world manifests itself, it manifests itself in precisely the ways you described, right? The kinds of intermediate organizations and clubs and churches and local communities that would have pushed back against the kind of simplistic polarization or defining by opposition tend to go by the wayside, or at least get put in their place relative to the idolatry of the national politics. And so it's become a cliche in my circles to say this, but it's still worth saying. you used to sit next to somebody you really disagreed with at church, for instance, or at the local VFW, or on the bleachers at the local Little League game. But now the great sort, coupled with the great algorithm mix and sorting, has produced a very, very different kind of way of being in the world.
Yeah, and I what I'm starting to see, especially around amongst people my own age, that politics is starting to fill this kind of existential vacuum that's created by the lack of, I guess, religious experience, family, communal, cultural belonging. And again, like it's what happens to the people's political positions becomes a kind of performance of, them projecting their psychological wounds, their existential insecurity, attempting to find some sense of belonging, some kind of meaning or purpose. But again, like their position is very much disconnected from what they're living in their everyday lives. So people can be posting on the internet about all these social issues, about these moral issues, but what's happening in your everyday life? It's usually not integrated, like your position is not integrated into how you're actually living. So you see that the breakdown of the local community, of the family, all these things, like makes politics into something much bigger than it ever was meant to be,
And especially national politics. And we used to say all politics is local, and I just think that's, people still say that. I just don't think that's true. I mean, it can be true, but in a general sense, it's often not true. So many local things are now nationalized for the reasons that you just described. And maybe a little bit later we might talk about this in more detail, but I think we see that post Roe, post Dobbs, right, where maybe in a healthier environment it would be kind of situation where we could have the laboratory of the states in a very serious way, and take some time for Louisiana to do things differently than California, and Ohio to do things differently than New Jersey. But so many of these things, especially with money, and especially again with the internet and algorithms, get nationalized so very quickly in ways we don't really have a chance to see what positive and negative things come out of the laboratory of the states in a way that we may have in the past.
So can you remember a particular time in your own experience or in your own life that like the attention to politics started to shift from more local affairs to solely the national? Because like if I think about myself, when I was a younger kid, I heard people talk about local stuff, not for very long though. But I'm wondering, like for you, if you remember some like definitive moment.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one I haven't thought about before, but it is a good question. Immediately, what popped into mind most of all was 9/11, I guess, and especially the kind of double gut punch of 9/11 plus the failure of the Iraq War. I think it was hard to think about those two events in a local way. We thought about them clearly on a national way, and there was good reason to do so. But that, coupled with the rise of the blogosphere at the time, and then not too long after that, the rise of social media and cable news. Well, I guess the rise of Fox News at the time was really substantial, but cable news would become bifurcated, or at least siphoned off in very analogous ways to the ways we're talking about here, in ways that support the various kinds of things we're talking about here. But I do remember a time very clearly before 9/11 where in fact, I was proud of this. I grew up in Wisconsin as a Midwest boy. I still really consider myself, like the last 14 years, a Midwest boy. I was very proud of Wisconsin, and it's what I took to be as just being very different in so many ways. From the time we were very young and learned about Wisconsin history, and we learned about the kind of progressive yet grounded kind of rural way of, but still very heavily manufacturing. I mean, we took a kind of local pride and had a kind of local politics that just but I think especially, well, here I'll finish this overly long answer with this one. I think with Paul before, as a Wisconsin guy, we really saw the kind of nationalization of Wisconsin in a way that I think, especially when Paul Ryan became a national figure, but was very well known for being from Wisconsin, and the kinds of discussions that were had on a national level, again, online especially, but not only, nationalized Wisconsin's conversation as well. Now that might have been a somewhat unique circumstance because Paul Ryan became a vice presidential candidate, became a very important leader within the Republican Party and whatnot. But I think that's the kind of thing that you can see happening over and over, where a formerly really interesting, really different, really, frankly, unique even place kind of got caught up and remains caught up. Twitter always shows me Wisconsin related tweets for some reason. I did not choose that, but their algorithm has done so. And I can just see the major political figures in Wisconsin just talking about the national stuff, right? That's basically how they get their one final thing I guess to mention is that's how you raise your money too. It's the money's not raised locally. So, or for the most part. So if you want to get your money from Planned Parenthood, if you want to get it from National Right to Life, if you want to get it from American Enterprise Institute or wherever you want to get it from, you're going to get it in the folks who are interested in the nationalized conversation.
Yeah. So I mean, now that you're saying that, it makes you see how a lot of this disconnect is not only from the breakdown of local communities, local politics, but it's also, I mean, I think breakdown of logic, of the capacity to recognize nuances that probably is in large part due to the proliferation of information on the internet that, like you can put anything out there, and what ends up happening is that we're drawn to stuff that catches our attention, and then our ability to recognize, details, distinctions is, I'm just seeing more and more kind of falling apart,
Same.
Yeah, especially when it comes to like you were saying, engaging with people who have a different point of view, it's becoming harder to recognize, hey, like this person has a different understanding, whether it's because of their upbringing, their personality, their temperament, but we can engage, we can talk about it. I can try to understand their position, argue against it. Now it's this very Manichaean, dualistic, like you're evil because you disagree and you don't believe these things. I don't know. I wonder how much of it is like a lack of charity for your opponent, or just like a kind of, I hate to say it, but a stupidity, like an inability to understand another position. I think it's both, honestly. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's both, and in some individuals it might be both, but it might be both in a way that describes some people better than others. I think I mean, here's something. I don't know what you think about this. I was doing some thinking in advance of our conversation, and I wonder if the kinds of issues that are now front and center are also just so foundational, right? I mean, liberalism itself is being challenged in a way that it wasn't before. The very idea, I mean, there were some people, 10, 20 years ago, challenging the very idea of sex and gender, but not many. That conversation has been mainstream now. Abortion has been around for a while, obviously, and the stakes couldn't be higher when it comes to that. I guess I just wonder the proliferation of just foundational questions, right? Has that been part of this too? That if it's sex and gender that's up for grabs, if it's the very notion of liberal government that's up for grabs, if it's prenatal justice versus the autonomy of women that's up for grabs, the stakes are just that high that it's tough, right? It's tough to say, well, I'm going to sit next to this person and talk to them, even though they want to destroy everything that I think is good and true about the culture. So, that's too big, but that's too dramatic. But do you think there's something true about that? That especially, you have your podcast is titled Cracks in Postmodernity. Do you think with the kind of deconstruction that's been going on, we're just in a different place than we were 10, 20 years ago?
That is a good point, because I mean, I see for people like, if you take abortion, if you really, really believe that, they do have the right to terminate pregnancy because you perceive giving birth, carrying to term to be a really painful, heavy burden, for someone to have the belief that, that being has a right to be born. The stakes are higher, but again, it's like how much are the stakes? It's a matter of perception versus I don't know, because if we speak economically, yeah, like I do think it's harder to carry to term to raise your child if you're going to keep it. Like that's a reality. But again, how much of that is like, are we educated to understand that the child is so much of a burden? Or if we take sex and gender, like someone who doesn't fit into a gender stereotype, um, to feel like you have to be forced to be something that you're not, can be really suffocating. But again, it's like, is it just, I don't know, like how much of it is this perception that this is who I am versus that. But that's why I think the breakdown of nuance is like, for someone who doesn't fit into a gender category as a gender stereotype, it's like, it's one thing to say, okay, well, now I'm the opposite sex and I'm going to transition and I'm going to change my pronouns, and then the opposite of the extreme of like, oh, I have to act this way because society. It's like, where is this nuanced middle ground where it's like, okay, yeah, like you have certain genitals, you are this gender, there's room for experimentation, there's room for you to like try to have an integrated sense of your own gender without having to be someone you're not. It's, I don't know, I think it's a mix of a lot of factors, but I am finding myself more and more surprised by the breakdown of logic and the nuance. Like, at least when I see people post stuff on the internet, I'm like, are you really serious about what you're saying? Like, there's this hysteria, this, I don't know. Like, I do find it kind of shocking, and I wonder if, like, is it really a lack of intelligence now at this point that we're dealing with?
And again, that certainly could be true in some circumstances, but I'm sure you've seen otherwise intelligent people say things that befuddle you and seem just, almost bizarre. And how could somebody say that? And again, I just wonder, it really is a question, and I kind of just wondering, are that because of the deconstruction and because of so many institutions and foundational ideas having been are now being up for grabs in a way that they weren't 10, 20, 30 years ago, are the stakes just so high now that that calls for nuance, calls for understanding arguments, calls for encountering those who disagree seem kind of quaint, right? Like if everything's a Flight 93 type situation, because the stakes are just so high, I wonder, or understood to be mostly wrongly, a Flight 93 situation. Then the stakes are just so high that calls for those kind of things can just seem, either quaint or even dangerous, right? No, I mean, we're not going to do that. It's time to act. It's time to defeat the enemy here.
Yeah, so again, it's what I was saying before about this need to fill this existential vacuum. But at least with the in the American context, I'm seeing more and more of this like near puritanical anxiety to prove your moral worth, your moral superiority. Like people are so afraid to be on the wrong side. So we must virtue signal, or else like we are evil, we're bad. And it's like that moral anxiety, there's something true there. Like there is a real desire to pursue what is good. But again, the fact that it's so disintegrated from our everyday lives, like
Yeah,
turns into this hysteria.
that's the main thing I think is so important. If you live a culture of encounter with the local, with the folks, with a diverse group of people, it's much easier to see that it's not a Flight 93 situation.
Yeah.
And yeah, so
Yeah. So I mean, now I want to go a little bit more into the content of this breakdown of the left right duopoly binary, because in a lot of the stuff you've been writing, you're showing how these, I guess, these stereotypical views we have of the categories left and right, like now it's just kind of becoming a blur. Like, you see people who are typically are aligned with the left now have values that some people will consider right and all that. So I think one of the main markers that we're seeing, I mean, you've written this, I see other authors saying this, is that a lot of it has to do with college education. Like people who go to college, get a degree, tend to have or either, I don't know, because of temperament or because of conditioning, see the world a particular way, and that shapes whatever party they align themselves with. But you've also been saying a lot about just working class people, especially immigrants, people of color, and how typically would be seen aligned with the left, not really fitting so much into the Democratic Party's platform. So can you say more just about that shift that you're seeing, especially amongst the working class, people of color, immigrants?
Yeah, I mean, one real dramatic issue that I think just illustrates this almost perfectly is that of assisted suicide.
Mhm.
So, like many so-called social issues, people of color, and especially the economically vulnerable, and especially economically vulnerable people of color, tend to be more "quote unquote" conservative on those issues. Though again, I'm not sure what these terms even really refer to at the end of the day, but um, and that's very true of assisted suicide, and not least because people of color, especially blacks, have had such a horrible experience with the U.S. healthcare system, and to the point where I was shocked to learn, even if just a few years ago, that a good that so many privileged whites think of at the end of life, something like hospice, is really looked at with deep skepticism in Black communities,
Mhm.
for precisely because they're so distrustful, with good reason, for how they're treated at the end of life by the medical community. Now, what we and often the reasons that are given for this are religious, but not always. They often, just as often, maybe even have to do with more secular values that include, a kind of anti-ableism, a sense that all human beings matter the same, regardless of their age or their ability to be productive or contribute to society or something. Um, on the other hand, and so that their opposition is often, what we might consider left, right, or progressive in terms of how they think about anti-ableism, anti-violence, concern for the most vulnerable, worries about structures, right? So it's not just about an individual case or an individual person, but what kind of structures are put in place as a result of a policy. And so even if you might think in the abstract that it's right for a particular individual, you also, if you're a good progressive, need to think about what structures are created and how those structures impact the most vulnerable, especially. Um, on the other hand, those who tend to be in favor of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia tend to identify more with the left, but they tend to, and again, not clear what these terms mean, but they tend to be very, they tend to use concepts and approaches that are identified with, again, what does these terms mean, but the right, or conservatives, or at least libertarians, right? So this is my body. I get to do whatever I want with this. I'm an individual. No one can really tell me what I can do with this. There's a lot of different points of view on this question. We should let a thousand flowers bloom. The government should kind of stay out of it. And let's give priority to the individual who's acting in his or her own interest here. And that even happens at the academy. That happens at bioethics conferences all the time. People who otherwise identify as very progressive end up making, sounding like Rand Paul or something on this particular issue. And so while this is one particular issue where it just fits so perfectly, there's just a number of issues that are like this. And Trump's rise, I think, has maybe made that even more clear than it was before. I mean, we got a bunch of people who are identified with Republicans or the right now who are for tariffs, right? And those kind of interventions overseas that used to be anathema to the right. And especially during Trump's presidency, though it's changed a little bit during the Biden administration, but during Trump's presidency, you got all these folks on the left saying, no, this is bad. We should not do this, right? Let's have free markets, and let's have these agreements that many people think has really hurt the working class, but benefits the overall kind of utilitarian calculation of GDP or something like that. So, so just even back to the original point from your very first question, just a moment's reflection about these questions really, really destroys any concept that there could be a kind of like a right or a left kind of position on these things. They just don't fit. They don't work. They get scrambled all the time. I've used an analogy to how a kind of Ptolemaic vision of the universe, right, with a geocentric universe, would think about stars that didn't appear to behave as they were supposed to be behaving if the Earth was the center. They would imagine that these stars had something called epicycles that would, they would kind of move around in a circle to help explain why their geocentric Ptolemaic kind of vision of the universe was correct. I often feel like something analogous is happening here. We tell ourselves these stories. we imagine certain things are this way or that way just to fit with this model that we've created for ourselves. But what really needs to go is the model. We just need to stop talking as if there's like a right and a left, and just be much more nuanced and careful and inclusive about the kinds of structures we create when we talk about these things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really struck by the cognitive dissonance that I'm seeing, especially when it comes to like economic versus cultural life issues. Because as you're saying, like you have these quote unquote Republican conservatives all about life, right to life, etc. But the economic policies really don't reflect this attitude towards life as a gift, instead are falling to these very pragmatic utilitarian views of material resources. And then the same on the other side, that this kind of radical individualism really is playing into this idea that, I don't know, like we're these atomized individuals, and that ultimately what matters is, I guess, the will to power, and like when you talk about the consistent life ethic, that these things are all integrated. It's like people are so fixated on being on a certain side that we're not actually thinking through what is like the logical consequence of my position, and is it integrated with all the other aspects of life, of society. And I think you said this in the intro, the resisting throwaway culture, that these platforms are determined by corporate interests. Like people aren't sitting and thinking through, like, again, what are the consequences of this position? Is this coherent? It's like, no, somebody makes a platform based on what's economically most prudent for them, and then people just buy into it blindly. Again, like, is it a moral problem that people are too lazy to do the work of thinking through it? Is it a lack of intelligence? I don't know, but I find the cognitive dissonance to be really striking at times.
Let me say two things about that. The
Yeah.
first is, and I've lived this personally, it's hard if you want to be effective on the national level, especially, and it's even harder if you want to be effective with getting grant money or getting a donor to help, if you explicitly reject these categories and these ways of approaching this, because so much of the money, so much, as you mentioned, the corporate, but not only the corporate, just folks who have money who are looking to donate to someone. You kind of have to say, well, I agree with you about this, but this other thing that you stand for, really, I'm not for that. In fact, I'm working against it in a certain way. So it's really hard, frankly, to work in the current structures the way they're set up, with this thing in mind. And I'm speaking from my own experience there, but if I can also speak from my own experience about what I've discussed with others, about this, fairly high placed people. I used to be on the board of Democrats for Life, and I would sometimes go on the Hill lobbying for various things. Like I would, most recently, the last one I think was for trying to get funding for perinatal hospice, trying to help women and babies and families who were dealing with a very difficult prenatal diagnosis, and give them an option to care and love for the child through pregnancy and after pregnancy without causing them any pain. You would get, I got to tell you, Stephen, you would get Republicans who would say, what, I have to tell you, I'm personally for this kind of social justice kind of oriented.
You were saying the Republicans and the social justice, they're personally for it.
Yeah, so they would give their version of what they really thought, right? And they said, I'm personally for more funding for perinatal hospice. I'm personally for funding nursing homes at a different level. I'm personally for paid family leave. But the structures are such that I can't, the political structure is such that I can't do that publicly. I can't publicly come out for those things. And also on the so-called left, again, so-called right, so-called left, we talked with a lot of Democrats who would, not just pro-life Democrats, who there were some more at the time, but pro-choice Democrats to say, what, I think I could get behind 20 weeks, 15 weeks as a restriction. We were trying to propose, like, could we do a kind of like a grand bargain where we had a 15, 20-week ban plus a lot of social support for women. And again, like if you talk to these folks and their staff, they would be personally for these things, but the structures were such, the political expectations and structures were such that they couldn't publicly support them. And so even at the very highest levels of Congress, senators and representatives, there were these personal nuances. There were people who said, you know what, let's stop talking about epicycles and this nonsense. I don't fit into this right left life choice binary. But nevertheless, they were bound. I think mostly because of fundraising, but also because of some of the other things we've been talking about, to kind of toe the line and play the epicycle game, even though they knew it wasn't true. Even if not only did they know it wasn't true, they explicitly told me they believed something different.
Yeah, and in a second, I want to ask you more about what you're seeing happening, at least on the side of the Republican Party. But no, I did want to mention first, at least with the kind of ideological approach to social justice. You wrote in this article about all the criticism that Archbishop Gomez was getting about his quote unquote anti-woke letter. It was interesting because I'm seeing that right now this kind of post-structure. I mean, I don't know, like I don't want to call it woke because it's a bogeyman in itself, but ultimately it's this post-structuralist approach to social issues that right now I feel like has a monopoly on social justice activism, to the point that anyone who doesn't espouse this post-structuralist worldview is not on the right side. You're on the wrong side. So someone like the Archbishop who's saying, yeah, like post-structuralism does purport to be this totalizing worldview, which is what a religion does. Yeah, like it's problematic. Not that it's all evil and horrible, but yeah, we definitely need to question it. People are coming at him saying like, oh, you're racist and you're this and that. And you point out in the article that he's done anti-racist work. So it's on one side, at least within like the religious context, I do think that these post-structuralists are filling in a vacuum that the churches, that the religious institutions have created because of a lack of being involved in offering a real, at least with the Catholic Church, like offering a real Catholic response to these social issues. So like that's one thing to consider. But on the other hand, it's like, why is it that we're at this point where there can only be one way to approach these social issues? Why is there this monopoly, especially, I mean, you would know being in the university setting, like it's this post-structuralist worldview, this postmodern worldview, like this is it. Like if you don't have this approach, then like we can't have a conversation.
So I really do think there are some well-meaning people amongst the post-structuralist / woke, whatever category, successor ideology people who, like you said, filling a void, filling a gap that especially the church has left open here, or at least the Church of the United States has left open here. But like you said, as a member of the Academy, I must admit, being somewhat cynical and skeptical, frankly, about what I often hear coming about from a lot of these folks, because the stuff that I hear doesn't often reflect the actual views of the marginalized populations they claim to stand for and to be speaking for. So if you just go back to the example I was using earlier on end of life issues and euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, a racial justice analysis, structural racism, looking at how structural racism has played a role in medicine and end of life issues, would come to a very different conclusion than the one that the vast majority of so-called woke folks in the Academy come to on that issue, right? Something very similar could be said about abortion. You do a racial justice analysis of how abortion has come to be and come to be used and come to work its way into our communities. You come to a very different conclusion about abortion than the one that's broadly shared in the Academy. So what do you do with all this? Well, again, I do think there are some true believers, some well-meaning people who are trying to work with something that's difficult. I do think, though, to speak frankly, there are some who are just using it as a way of advancing a very different kind of agenda. And that's what I think Archbishop Gomez was really interested in pushing back on, right? To the extent that this is not about people of color and structural racism, it is often geared at against a very traditional vision of Christianity, often held by the very people who are supposedly being lifted up, right? And that's what frustrates me. That's what frustrates him. That's what frustrates so many people who are all in for racial justice, but who can't be all in with the kind of post-structural woke whatever successor ideology stuff, because frankly that it's often not about what it claims to be about. I think, I try to do my best to not offer what I think are the actual motivations of people, because it can really break down dialogue and discussion
Yeah.
in difficult ways. But at a certain point it just becomes so evident you have to call it out and say it's a problem,
Yeah.
and this is a problem.
Yeah. I mean, personally for me, like I find post-structuralism to be interesting within a contained kind of context. Like it raises super important questions, but it's not capable of becoming an all-encompassing vision of reality, which again is the role of a religion. Like it's not capable of it. And when people create this kind of, at least in academic settings, like give it this monopoly, it's like it's not capable of doing what you're trying to make it do. And then what ends up happening, as you said, like if we're going to use it to advocate for historically oppressed communities, what do we do with the fact that their worldview tends to be very different from this worldview of very bourgeois French intellectuals in the Sorbonne? Like they're living in two very different worlds. So like, sure, again, it can raise important questions about the condition of the oppressed, but at what point do we realize like people, immigrants, people of color, people coming from the developing world, like see the world very differently. And if what concerns me most is when you start, at least within a university setting, like when you start to impose this worldview on people coming from those backgrounds, like this is, Pope Francis says this, it's this ideological colonization, which ends up defeating the whole point of, the social justice kind of concerns. Like you end up oppressing the poor, if not materially, then at least existentially, spiritually, you know.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And if a person of color in the academy or as a student in a class even wants to speak up against the kind of orthodoxy that's enforced along these lines, they will themselves be considered themselves by others a kind of race traitor, right? A kind of um, disloyal, not a member of the cause. And can you imagine if that's the kind of thing you're up against as a structure in higher education? Of course, you're going to be pushed to toe the company line. Of course, you're going to be saying the things that don't rock the boat and that are expected of you. But I don't need to tell you. I mean, we were on the same Bronx campus together. The kinds of discussions that were going on there versus the ones that were happening just outside our very well guarded walls were just like in two different universes, right? They're just not even remotely compatible. But if you stepped onto the campus, you were expected to, I think it's fair to say, largely expected to speak a very insulated, again, orthodoxy, a kind of set of positions that weren't to be challenged. But again, if we take the views of vulnerable people of color seriously, who are again disproportionately religious, and disproportionately traditionally religious, we just end up in a far more nuanced place, a far more interesting place, a far more a place that could actually open itself up, frankly, to discussion and debate and the challenging of orthodoxy, which is where higher education, at least in theory, is supposed to be. So that is the thing that is most frustrating for me at all. What kinds of conversations are missed when the kind of orthodoxy that's enforced is in fact enforced.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can at least say about the institution we were at. I found interesting the fact that at least the Jesuits take hands-on social justice work, or at least charitable work, seriously, and afforded students many opportunities. And I remember going on a kind of mission service trip to another country, and one of the tenets of our like, what is it? I don't know, like our kind of program is spirituality, very vaguely defined. And no one on this in this group was particularly religious, most of them. Some said they were Marxists, some were, just whatever. Um, and I remember when we were at the service trip, like we were building a house and we were interacting with the local community, and they were all super religious, either very Catholic or Pentecostal. And the reaction of my classmates was very like politely condescending, like, oh, it's so cute that they have a procession with the Mary statue, all these old ladies, that's so sweet. Or like, oh, they still believe in that stuff. Oh, that's cute. But one day they're going to see that they're being oppressed by this patriarchal system that's controlling them. So it's
Yeah.
like, it's funny on one hand that you see this elitist, very bourgeois mentality coming out from people who have really good intentions. But also, what gave me hope is that, like, we were interacting with people in a developing country with this very theistic worldview.
Yeah,
So at least having that hands-on interaction gives them something concrete to think about now when they're trying to do this advocacy, even if their way of construing, the worldview of these people is kind of messed up. So it's just a testament to the fact that, like, those who do have a concern with social issues, the best way to do it is be involved with the people, learn
exactly.
from the people you want to advocate from.
Exactly.
You know,
Well said.
but yeah. But anyway, so no, I do want to talk a little bit more because you've written about the shift within the Republican Party, conservatism in the US. What do you see as the future of the GOP? What do you think could happen or should happen there?
Well, I guess it's tough to answer that question because in some ways a big part of what we've done over the last 40 minutes or whatever it's been is even just trouble the very notion of the GOP itself. Like, what is a Republican? Right? I'm not even sure post-Trump what the content of that category is, to be honest. It's a slightly more, I mean, there is not even a platform now for the party. um, it's slightly more clear what it means to be a Democrat, but even there's so much diversity. There's so much, again, if you have a traditional Christian Black woman from South Carolina who voted for Joe Biden, right, in the primary and saved Joe Biden actually in the primary this last time around. That's going to be a very, very different Democrat than somebody who's going to go to an academic conference in our world. So, again, what do we even mean by a Republican or the GOP is up for grabs in a significant way. That said, I mean, there is a party, there are people in the party, there are power structures in the party, and they do seem to be more open to kind of focus on government, not the way the Democrats are necessarily, but quite different from I grew up in the Reagan era where the government that governs best is the government that governs least, right? They may not be for $6 trillion, but they might be for $1 trillion, right, for a particular program. Or they might not be for student loan forgiveness, but they're definitely for student loans. Or they're, they might not be for paid family leave coming from the federal government, but they'd be for, as Marco Rubio is, allowing people to take time off the end of their Social Security and use it during their pregnancy or soon after they give birth. Mm-hmm. They might not be for a single payer healthcare system, but at least a lot of the folks who identify with the right that I talk to are definitely for some creative arrangement where families are allowed to care for their elderly loved ones at home rather than in nursing homes. And if that means Medicaid and Medicare reimbursed for that or something, then that's what that means, or they're open to creative conversations about that. So it's way, way more interesting and complicated than it was during the Reagan administration and even during the time when Paul Ryan was kind of calling the shots. With Trump, again, we just have a very different, we have a very, very different party, to the extent there is even a single party that's coherent. And then finally, let me say, the abortion decision in Dobbs has really caused a number of pro-lifers who would identify as, who even maybe came of age during the Reagan years, to cause them to rethink a lot of this and to say, maybe there are things that we can do on the level of government to support women and families. And those conversations are ongoing. I'm in the middle of some of them myself. In fact, there's going to be I am part of a a group of people that are going to try to come up with a document that says, in light of Dobbs, we're open to, as conservatives, we're open to these kinds of social justice interventions. And the final document is not done, and then it'll be circulated. And I wouldn't be surprised if that document gets a lot of signatures that are going to surprise people. So it's in flux, and that's actually a good thing, it seems to me. Where it ends up, again, acknowledging the content of it is also up for grabs. I'm not sure, but it's going to be it already is better than it was, when I was growing up, and I hope it continues in the trajectory it's on.
Yeah, and I definitely think it's interesting, as you're saying, and as you've written, that you have these figures like Marco Rubio, even Tucker, who are very critical of socialist kind of policies, but also critical of capitalism and rampant capitalism, as you said. Like, there is some hope for these nuanced positions that don't veer to an extreme, so really look at the real concrete needs of the people. But the other thing I was going to ask is about third parties, because you got a lot of attention when you publicly left the Democratic Party and went with the American Solidarity Party, which has a very distinctively Christian Catholic social teaching kind of base platform. What do you say to people who think voting third party is a wasted vote?
Yeah. For some, it might be a wasted vote if you have views that are different than mine. I can imagine somebody saying that it is a wasted vote. But if you're in, at least, I can imagine a person with two different kinds of folks thinking that maybe they'd be open to this, or they think maybe it's wasted, but they're open to hearing something different. So if you think that the duopoly, the kind of antagonistic binary opposition that we have, is the foundational problem here, right? If the foundational problem is we're operating as if we're in a geocentric universe, and we need to fundamentally shake that up before really anything else can really happen, then this is the way to do that, right? And to do that in a way that calls to mind, before the Civil War, right? Especially before the Civil War, there were all kinds of parties that would come and go. It's highly unusual. Our founders in the first century of Americans, U.S. Americans, would find it very strange that we're in this kind of situation where there are only these two parties. In fact, let's just be honest, we have had very similar kinds of shifts, but we just kind of use these placeholder names to describe what comes next, just because, again, it's kind of the epicycle approach. We just pretend that this is the way it is. We have had the Whigs change to the Republicans, right? Or the know-nothings come and go, but we've just decided to pretend that that's not the case by shoving them into these other categories. And honest people do say, well, there's a Republican coalition, and there's kind of these three parties within it or whatever. But in the main, we don't think of that as the way things work in the United States. But if you then here's another. So the first group would be folks who say we need to jettison our equivalent of geocentrism before anything else can get done. Then the next and second kind of person, I imagine, would be somebody who thinks that rightly, I would say, that the two parties are just so utterly evil in the things that they support, that it would be kind of compromise of your values to put your vote behind one party or the other. And so that would be another reason, I think, to say, well, a pox on both your houses, essentially. So yeah, it's not a vote, obviously, for the American Solidarity Party to win the presidency in 2024, but it's a vote for the future, as it were.
Have you looked at Kanye West's birthday party platform?
I've heard of it, and I think I did glance at it once, because I wrote up a piece on him around that time. But so the answer is yes, but I'm not sure I remember that much, except finding it interesting.
It's a pretty good platform. I think if the Democrats were smart, they would put him as the candidate, because I don't know. It's not realistic, but the platform itself was really good. Like, integrated a lot of just focus on like Black communities, but within this kind of Christian worldview, which I was impressed by. I don't know if he actually came up with it, but worth considering. considering. Um, but no, so now kind of to wrap things up, I do want to talk about Roe. I do want to trigger people. Um, yeah, so I have this very skeptical millennial kind of attitude towards what's going on because uh, let me just give a disclaimer to anyone who's listening. I'm open to any people's positions, blah, 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 safe space, whatever. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that in an ideal world, every being should exist, should be valued. But we don't live in an ideal world. We don't live in an ideal culture. The belief that a fetus, a not fully developed life form, should exist, like this requires a real understanding of human nature, to really understand that life is a gift, that in any condition, in any phase of its existence. First of all, like, is the system, the economic system, but also like the moral framework of this nation capable of sustaining such an idea, such a law? That's first what I'm skeptical of. Like, I really do think this is primarily a culture of death. So, like, if we're gonna have a law that really recognizes the dignity of every life, especially a life that's not fully developed, um, it's different. I don't know, like, should we have that law? That's one question. Is it sustainable? That's what I'm concerned about. Um, I don't know. So what do you say to that? Like, do you think that this kind of law, like if all the states were to ban abortion completely, is it sustainable?
I mean, I'm not sure what sustainable means in that context.
Mhm.
I I think you know very well that like New York and California are bastions of abortion rights, and will it's hard to imagine a possible world in the next 10 to 20 years where they become something different than that. Um, I don't know what you think about Ireland, but up until fairly recently, they had in their constitution explicit support for prenatal justice
Mhm.
and fantastic outcomes for women, health outcomes for women. Yeah, there were some Irish that went to the UK and Germany for abortions and whatnot, but for the most part, they really did make a commitment to supporting women and treating all human beings as equal, including prenatal human beings. Um, that's not a culture that different from ours, right?
Mhm.
So uh, I mean, I guess I just think yes, it's sustainable, and there are some places that are states that are kind of doing this right now. So, and there are frankly some states who basically had, even though abortion was legal for some time now, years if not decades, have had virtually no abortions because there've been like one or two abortion clinics in the whole state. And a lot of very few people wanted to do abortions in states like South Dakota or Alabama. So, and those societies did not collapse. They did not have um, a kind of unraveling. Again, I'm not sure what you mean by sustainable there. Now, if you're pointing to the fact that a lot of states that are going to ban abortion, it's probably better. I like to talk about it in positive terms, protect prenatal justice.
Mhm.
Um, don't have a consistent view of human dignity. I agree with that. Like that is just totally the case. But that was true of almost every polity that starts, including human beings that weren't included in the circle of protection before.
Mhm.
So it's a journey. It's a we're hopefully bending towards justice here. Um, but it's not perfect, obviously, and there's more work to do. And so, yes, there will be states that protect prenatal justice but have the death penalty, and that's terrible. There will also be states that have a really significant social safety net for immigrants, like California, but are basically havens of prenatal violence and dismembering of children simply because they're disabled. That's equally horrible, right? It's a cognitive and moral dissonance that is just almost omnipresent. But that doesn't mean we don't work for progress. That doesn't mean we don't try to have a coherent view of human dignity and of social justice and of nonviolence. But I guess I do. Chile is another country that I point to sometimes, they banned most abortion a few years ago, and they've actually seen a rise in their maternal health outcomes, an improvement.
Yeah.
So when I think of places like Ireland and Chile and Poland and a few other places, I do think it's sustainable. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, like when I say sustainable, I'm thinking first on a kind of a basic material financial level, but then the moral cultural level is what intrigues me most, because when I see especially women go into hysterics about this, who really feel themselves to be so threatened by the potential of losing, access to abortion, it's like, what is going to enable a person to recognize that this heavy, I'm not going to call it a burden, but it's a drama. Like, to bring life into the world is a dramatic thing. Whether you think it's a burden, whether you think it's a gift, okay. But I feel like this question of educating someone, accompanying someone to recognize this drama as a gift, even a painful gift, like that's a huge work. And I just wonder, like, is it time? Like, can we enact such laws without first doing that work of educating people to experience life in this way? Is it prudent to, take away abortion access, or to, however we want to phrase it? Like, I don't know, like I see especially young people who are freaking out right now, and I'm like, I see why you're freaking out. I'm not freaking out because I see that life is a gift, even though yes, it implies a drama and sacrifice. But I want people to see that too. And I just wonder, like, the law is not enough to educate someone to see life this way.
Yeah, no, that's a real concern. Um, I will say that there's almost always freaking out when a new a new kind of regime trying to protect vulnerable people with the law does that, and
Yeah.
especially if it threatens the power and security and even safety. Let's be honest, of certain other groups. That's historically not unusual. That doesn't mean we don't take it seriously and do the best we can to say, for instance, and not enough pro-lifers have done this, it seems to me, though we're really up against a media which is invested in scaring people, frankly.
Yeah.
We are not doing enough to say, look at places like Ireland and Chile. We can protect prenatal justice and protect women at the same time, and protect and support women at the same time. There's no inherent contradiction between that at all. In fact, it's often women. Every single major pro-life organization in the country is led by a woman. The most strong pro-lifers I know are women, especially young pro-lifers are women. Some of the most aggressively pro-choice people I know are men.
Yeah.
We've done a lot of pathologizing of pregnancy and of women's bodies, frankly, in ways that fit that kind of patriarchal approach to all of this. And that's been done by people who are very cynically manipulating the narrative, right, to try to get the kind of abortion policy they want. But we don't have to pathologize pregnancy or women's bodies. We don't have to choose between protecting babies and supporting women and making sure women are healthy. It's been proven already that we can have both. And in point of fact, these states are going to do what they're going to do. So states that are dominated by people who are more afraid are going to have a very different kind of law than states that are really trying to, that are not so afraid. And women and young women will be a part of both of those polities, right? Both kinds of polities. The internet, of course, is a place that's dominated by the left and by people with certain kinds of views on these questions. So we don't always get maybe a good cross section of the United States from that.
Does anyone have a right to life, though? I mean, like, rights discourse. Like, is it like, I don't know. I find that discourse to be super not compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly not theologically. Well, it has its theological problems to be sure, but that's kind of what we're dealing with in a way as well. But if anyone has a right to life, it's certainly those who are vulnerable and voiceless,
Mhm.
dependent, um, who need someone to speak up on their own, in their own defense, on the defense of another. Um, Again, I think there are theological problems that way, but yeah,
Yeah, because I see inevitably coming up is that, like, if prenatal life has a right to exist, what about the rights of everybody else? It's like, I just feel like rights discourse, it's built to lead to these oppositions, these clashes. Whereas if, I don't know, we're educated to view these things as a matter of givenness, gifts, then like it's harder for this thing for it to be a conflict when it's like, okay, something's given and I'm being asked to receive something. If it's rights, then I don't know. I just naturally don't like, instinctively don't like rights discourse, but that's the world we live in. That's how we
yeah,
talk.
yeah, and it implicitly plays into this power dynamic that we've been mentioning throughout. A right is a claim; it's a claim on someone else often, and this is what we have, and the church has used it, and for better or for worse. But I'm with you. I think it can hide more than it reveals much of the time.
Yeah. Well, any last thoughts before we wrap up? Any last things you want to put out there before we go?
No, I think rather than talking about rights, you can talk about human dignity and seeing the image of God in all human beings. And to the extent that we do that, the kinds of things we've been talking about the last hour or so just go much better. So, and
Yeah.
I'm saying this to remind myself as much as anyone, right? There's um, these every single person you encounter, even those that have views that are so abhorrent to you, bear the image and likeness of God in a way that demands that we bow before it, right? And if we can, especially as Christians, if we can keep that in the front of mind, all these things go so much better.
Yeah, I think that's a good question or a challenge to leave people with. Can you recognize something of value, something, the dignity of the person whose views you disagree with the most? I think it's an important work that we all should try to do. So, anything you want to plug before we go?
I have a new book coming out in November called One Church, which will
Yes.
build almost exactly on that insight. I mean, it goes a little bit further and talks about baptism as the kind of if we saw our baptism as the primary way we relate to each other, rather than these idolatrous foci on ideology and politics, national politics especially. Again, these things would go much better. So we'll see. I'm tilting at windmills here a little bit, but I still believe, I guess, that maybe we could prioritize our brothers and sisters in Christ in a way that breaks through those kind of idolatrous ways of viewing the world.
Nice. All right. Well, so with that, Charlie, thank you for coming on. This was good.
Thank you, Steve.